There we are. Hi. How's everybody? Just making sure we're all set up. I think we got David ready. We got me ready. The dogs are here sitting just out of camera view, but that's okay. Well, their heads are just out of camera view. So, hello. Everybody's doing really wonderfully. I forgot that I don't get notified because this is an unlisted show. So I have to go find it. Let's see. See if I can do it. Well, okay, wait. I can do it because I emailed you. I sent it to you guys. It's been a minute, hasn't it? I'm so glad you were here. Okay, let's see. I'm going to. So yes, as Diana said, in case anybody is watching like on Facebook and can't get it to work, um, you do have to, if you're using the mobile, you have to tell it to open in the browser. So like I on my phone, it's Safari. Oh, there we go. And then it'll open it in YouTube. So, hi. Don't forget to hit that like button. Let's see. Hi to Kelsey. My parents are here, Dan and Nicole. Emily. Yeah, David. So, hope everybody's having a great night. Also, my camera keeps doing this. It's a new thing since we changed my computer up. I don't know what it's doing. So, I don't know why or how. So I will periodically just have to reset this camera. Hi. Probably this one. Bring it down so we can see dogs. Bring it over that way so we can see Lucy a little bit better. All right. Hi, Lucy. Hi. Okay. Oh, David says he's going to try a new approach, improving based on the general feel because I don't feel like taking notes. All right. Okay, I'm going to put this over here so hopefully I will see if it changes. All right, so tonight I am going to do another Edgar Allan Poe. This one is basically one of the very first murder mystery novels, right? It's kind of like Sherlock Holmes before Sherlock Holmes. Okay. Yeah. Hi, puppies. All right. So this is Edgar Allan Poe. This is The Murders in Rue Morgue. So here we go. Wait, before I start, is the volume level okay? Somebody give me a thumbs up. So one more problem with this new setup is that I can't actually reach the soundboard. So if you need me to turn up the volume, tell me now. And that way I can change it or else I will start. Okay, Diana says volume is good. All right. Then we will get started. Okay. So, again, this is Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in Rue Morgue. It is not improbable that a few steps farther. Nope, try that again. It is not improbable that a few farther steps in phrenological science will lead to a belief in the existence, if not the actual discovery and location of an organ of analysis. Oh, hi, Lucy. She doesn't want me to start. We'll try one more time. It is not improbable that a few steps far. Oh my God, I'm going to do it again. Here we go. Is everybody good? Okay. It is not improbable that a few farther steps in phrenological science will lead to a belief in the existence, if not the actual discovery and location of an organ of analysis. If this power, which may be described, although not defined, as the capacity for resolving thought into its elements, be not, in fact, an essential portion of what late philosophers term ideality, then there are indeed many good reasons for supposing it is a primitive faculty. That it may be a constituent of ideality is here suggested in opposition to the vulgar dictum, founded, however, upon the assumptions of grave authority, that the calculating and discriminating powers, causality and comparison, are at the variance with the imaginative, that the three, in short, can hardly coexist. But although thus supposed to receive opinion, the idea will not appear ill-founded when we observe that the process of invention or creation are strictly akin with the process of resolution, the former being nearly, if not absolutely, the latter conversed. It cannot be doubted that the mental features discoursed of as the analytical are, in themselves, but little susceptible of analysis. We appreciate them only in their effects. We know of them, among other things, that they are always to their possessor, when inordinately possessed, a source of the liveliest enjoyment. As the strong man exults in his physical ability, delighting in such exercises as call his muscles into action, so glories the analyst in that moral activity which disentangles. He derives pleasure from even the most trivial occupations, bringing his talent into play. He is most fond of enigmas, of conundrums, of hieroglyphs, exhibiting in his solutions of each and all a degree of acumen which appears to the ordinary apprehension preternatural. His results, brought about by the very soul and essence of method, have in truth the whole air of intuition. The faculty in question is possibly the most invigorated by mathematical study, and especially by that highest branch of it which, unjustly, and merely on account of his retrograde operations, has been called, as if par excellence, analysis. Yet to calculate is not in itself to analyze. A chess player, for example, does the one without effort at the other. It follows that the game of chess, in its effects upon men, mental character, is greatly misunderstood. I am not now writing a treatise, but simply prefacing a somewhat peculiar narrative by observation very much at random. I will, therefore, take occasion to assert that the higher powers of the reflective intellect are more decidedly and more usefully taxed by the inostinacious game of draughts than by all the elaborate frivolity of chess. In this latter, where the pieces have different and bizarre motions with various and variable values, that which is only complex is mistaken, and not unusual error, for that which is profound. The attention is here called powerfully into play. If it flag for an instant, an oversight is committed, resulting in injury or defeat. The possible moves being not only manifold, but involute, the chances of such oversights are multiplied, and in 9 cases out of 10, it is the more concentrative rather than the more acute player who conquers. In drafts, on the contrary, where the moves are unique and have but little variation, the probabilities of inadvertence are diminished, and the mere attention being left comparatively unemployed, what advantages are obtained by either party are obtained by superior acumen. To be less abstract, let us suppose that a game of draughts, where the pieces are reduced to 4 kings, and where, of course, no oversight is to be expected. It is obvious that here the victory can be decided, the players being all equal, only by some ricochet movement, the result of some strong exertion of the intellect. Deprived by ordinary resources, the analyst throws himself into the spirit of his opponent, identifies himself therewith, and not unfrequently sees thus, at a glance, the sole methods, sometimes indeed absurdly simple ones, by which he may seduce into miscalculation or hurry into error. Whist has long been noted for its influence upon what are termed the calculating powers, and men of the highest order of intellect have been known to take an apparently unaccountable delight in it, while eschewing chess as frivolous. Beyond doubt, there is nothing of a similar nature so greatly tasking the faculty of analysis. The best chess player in Christendom may be little more than the best chess player. But proficiency in whist implies capacity for success in all those most important undertakings where mind struggles with mind. When I say proficiency, I mean that perfection in the game, which includes a comprehension of all the sources, whatever be their character, from which legitimate advantage may be derived. These are not only manifold, but multiform, and lie frequently among recesses of thought altogether inaccessible to the ordinary understanding. To observe attentively is to remember distinctly, and so far the concentrative chess player will do very well at whist, while the rules of Hoyle, themselves based upon mere mechanism of the game, are sufficiently and generally comprehensible. Thus, to have a retentive memory and to proceed by the book are points commonly regarded as the sum total of good playing. But it is in matters beyond the limits of mere rules where the skill of the analyst is evinced. He makes, in silence, a host of observations and inferences. So perhaps do his companions. And the difference in the extent of information obtained lies not so much in the falsity of the inference as the quality of the observation. The necessary knowledge is that of what to observe. Our player confines himself not at all, nor, because the game is the object, does he reject deductions from things external to the game. He examines the countenance of his partner, comparing it carefully to that of each of his opponents. He considers the mode of assorting the cards in each hand, often counting trump by trump and honor by honor through the glances bestowed by their holders upon each. He notes every variation of face as the play progresses, gathering a fund of thought from the difference in the expression of certainty, of surprise, of triumph, or of chagrin. From the manner of gathering up a trick, he judges whether the person taking it can make another in the suit. He recognizes what is played through feint by the air which is thrown upon the table. A casual or inadvertent word, the accidental dropping or turning of a card, with the accompanying anxiety or carelessness in regard to its concealment. The counting of the tricks, with the order of their arrangements, embarrassment, hesitation, eagerness, or trepidation, all afford to his apparently intuitive perception indications of the true state of affairs. The first 2 or 3 rounds having been played, he is in full possession of the contents of each hand, and thenceforward puts down his cards with an absolute and precise purpose, as if the rest of the party had turned outward the faces of their own. The analytical power should not be confounded with simple ingenuity. For while the analyst is necessarily ingenious, the ingenuous man is often utterly incapable of analysis. I have spoken of this latter faculty as that of resolving thought into its elements, and it is only necessary to glance upon this idea to perceive the necessity of the distinction just mentioned. The constructive or combining powers, by which ingenuity is usually manifested, and to which the phrenologists, I believe erroneously, have assigned a separate organ, supposing it a primitive faculty, has been so frequently seen in those with intellect bordered otherwise upon idiocy, and have attracted general observation among writers on morals. Between ingenuity and the analytic ability there exists a difference far greater indeed than that between the fancy and the imagination, but of a character very strictly analogous. It will be found, in fact, that the ingenious are always fanciful, and the truly imaginative never otherwise than profoundly analytic. The narrative which follows will appear to the reader somewhat in the light of a commentary upon the propositions just advanced. Residing in Paris during the spring part of the summer of 18 something, I therefore contracted an intimacy with a Monsieur Auguste Dupin. This young gentleman was of an excellent, indeed of an illustrious family, but by a variety of untoward events had been reduced to such poverty that the quondam energy of his character succumbed beneath it, and he ceased to bestir himself in the world, or to care for the retrieval of his fortunes. By courtesy of his creditors, there still remained in his possession a small remnant of his patrimony, and upon the income arising from this he managed, by means of a vigorous economy, to produce the necessities of life without troubling himself about its superfluities. Books, indeed, were his sole luxuries, and in Paris these are easily obtained. Our first meeting was at an obscure library in Rue Montmartre, where the accident of our both being in search of the same very rare and very remarkable volume brought us into closer communication. We saw each other again and again. I was deeply interested in the little family history which he detailed to me with all that candor which a Frenchman indulges only when self is his theme. I was astounded, too, at the vast extent of his reading. And above all, I felt my soul enkindled within me by a wild fervor, and what I could only term the vivid freshness of his imagination. Seeking in Paris the objects I then sought, I felt that the society of such a man would be to me a treasure beyond price, and this feeling I frankly confided to him. It was at length arranged that we should live together during my stay in the city, and as my worldly circumstances were somewhat less embarrassed than his own, I was permitted to be at the expense of renting and furnishing in a style well suited to the rather fantastic gloom of our common temper. A time-eaten and grotesque mansion, long deserted, those superstitions into which we did not inquire, and tottering to its fall in a retired and desolate portion of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Had the routine of our life at this point been known to the world, we should have been regarded as madmen, although perhaps not as madmen of a harmless nature. Our seclusion was perfect. We admitted no visitors whatsoever. Indeed, the locality of our retirement had been carefully kept a secret from our own former associates, and it had been many years since Dupin had ceased to know or be known in Paris. We existed within ourselves alone. It was a freak of fancy in my friend, for what else shall I call it, to be enamored of the night for her own sake, and into this brasserie, and into all his others, I quietly fell, giving myself up to the wild whims of an utter abandon. The sable divinity would not herself dwell with us always, but we could counterfeit her presence. At the first dawn of the morning, we closed all the messy shutters of our old building, lighting a couple of tapers which, strongly perfumed, threw out only the ghastliest and feeblest of rays. By the aids of these, when we busied our souls in dreams, reading, writing, or conversing, until it warned by the clock of the advent of the true darkness. Then we sallied forth into the streets, arm in arm, continuing the topics of the day, or roaming far and wide until a late hour, seeking, amid the wild lights and shadows of the populous city, that infinity of mental excitement which quiet observation would afford. At such times I could not help remarking and admiring, although from his rich ideality I had been prepared to expect, a peculiar analytic ability in Dupin. He seemed to taken eager delight in its exercise, if not exactly in its display. And he did not hesitate to confess the pleasure thus derived. He boasted to me with a low, chuckling laugh that most men, in respect to himself, wore windows in their bosoms, and was wont to follow up such assertions by direct and very startling proofs of his intimate knowledge of my own. His manner at these moments was frigid and abstract. His eyes were vacant in expression, while his voice, usually a rich tenor, rose into treble, which would have sounded petulantly but for the deliberateness and entire distinctiveness of the enunciation. Observing him in these moods, I often dwelt meditatively upon the old philosophy of the bipart soul, and amused myself with the fancy of a double Dupin, the creative and the resolvent. Let it not be supposed, from what I have just said, that I am detailing any mystery or penning any romance. What I have described in the Frenchman was but the result of an excited or perhaps of a diseased intelligence. But the character of his remarks at the periods in question, an example will best convey the idea. We were strolling one night down the long, dirty street in the vicinity of the Palais Royal. Being both apparently occupied with thought, neither of us had spoken a syllable for 15 minutes at least. All at once, Dupin broke forth with these words. "He is a very little fellow, that's true, and would do better for the Théâtre de Vérité." "There could be no doubt of that," I replied unwittingly, and not at first observing, so much as I had been absorbed in reflection, the extraordinary manner in which the speaker had chimed in with my meditations. In an instant afterward, I recollected myself, and my astonishment was profound. "Dupin," I said gravely, "this is beyond my comprehension. I do not hesitate to say that I am amazed and can scarcely credit my senses. How was it possible that you should know that I was thinking of—" Here I paused to ascertain beyond a doubt whether he really knew of whom I thought. "Of Chantilly," he said. "Why did you pause? You were remarking to yourself that his diminutive figure unfitted him for tragedy." This is precisely what had formed the subject of my reflections. Chantilly was a quondam cobbler of the Rue Saint-Denis, who, becoming stage mad, had attempted the role of Xerxes in Serbilion's tragedy, so called, and been notoriously pasquinaded for his pains. "Tell me, for God's sake," I exclaimed, "the method, if there method be, by which you have been enabled to fathom my soul in this manner." In fact, I was even more startled than I would have been willing to express. "It was the It was the fruiterer," replied my friend, "who brought you to this conclusion, that the mender of souls was not of sufficient height for Xerxes, et id genus omne." "The fruiterer! You astonish me. I know no fruiterer whatsoever." "The man who ran up against you as we entered the street. It may have been 15 minutes ago." I now remembered that, in fact, a fruiterer carrying upon his head a large basket of apples had nearly thrown me down, by accident, as we passed from the rue into the thoroughfare where we now stood. But what this had to do with Chantilly, I could not possibly understand. There was not a particle of charlatanerie about Dupin. "I will explain," he said, "and that you may comprehend all clearly, we will first retrace the course of your meditations, from the moment in which I spoke to you until that of the rencontre with the fruiterer in question. The larger links of the chain ran thus: Chantilly, Orion, Dr. Nickel, Epicurus, stereotomy, the street stones, the fruiterer. There are few persons who have not, at some period of their lives, amused themselves in retracing the steps by which particular conclusions of their own mind have been obtained. The occupation is often of the full of interest, and he who attempts it for the first time is astonished by the apparently illimitable distance and incoherence between the starting point and the goal. What then must have been my amazement when I heard the Frenchman speak of what he had just spoken, and when I could not help acknowledging that he had spoken the truth. He continued. We had been talking of horses, if I remember all right, just before leaving the room. This was the last subject we discussed. As we crossed into the street, a fruiterer with a large basket upon his head, brushing quickly past us, thrust you into a pile of paving stones collected at a spot where the causeway is undergoing repair. You stepped upon one of the loose fragments, slipped, slightly strained your ankle, appeared vexed or sulky, muttered a few words, turned to look at the pile, and then proceeded in silence. I was not particularly attentive to what you did, but observation has become with me of late a species of necessity. You kept your eyes upon the ground, glancing with a petulant expression at the holes and ruts in the pavement, so that I saw you were still thinking of the stones. Until we reached the little alley called Le Martin, which has been paved, by the way of experiment, with the overlapping and riveted blocks. Here your countenance brightened up, and perceiving your lips move, I could not doubt that you muttered to yourself the word stereotomic. You continued the same inaudible murmur with a knit brow, as is the custom of a man tasking his memory, until I considered that you sought the Greek derivation of the word stereotomy. I knew that you could not find this moment without being brought to think of atomies, and thus the theories of Epicurus, and as we then discussed this subject not very long ago. I mentioned to you how singularly, yet with how little notice, the vague guesses of that noble Greek had met with a confirmation in the late nebular cosmology. I felt that you could not avoid casting your eyes upward to the great nebula in Orion, and I certainly expected that you would do so. You did look up, and now I was assured that I had correctly followed your steps. But in that bitter tirade upon Chantilly, which appeared in yesterday's Musée, the satirist, making some disgraceful allusions to the cobbler's change of name upon assuming the buskin, quoted a very peculiar Latin line upon whose meaning I have often conversed. I meant the line, perdidit antiquum littera prima sonum. I had told you that this was in reference to Orion, formerly written Urion, and from certain pungencies connected with this explanation, I was aware that you could not have forgotten it. It was clear, therefore, that you would not fail to combine the two ideas of Orion and Chantilly. That you did combine them, I saw by the character of the smile which passed over your lips. You thought of the poor cobbler's immolation. So far you had been stooping in your gait, but now I saw you draw yourself upon the full height. I was then sure that you reflected upon the diminutive figure of Chantilly. At this point I interrupted your meditations to remark that, as in fact he was a very little fellow, that Chantilly, he would do better at the Théâtre de Vérité. Not long after this, we were looking over an evening edition of Le Tribunal, when the following paragraphs arrested our attention. Extraordinary murders. This morning, about 3 o'clock, the inhabitants of the Quartier Saint-Roch were aroused from sleep by a succession of terrific shrieks, issuing, apparently, from the 4th story of the house in Rue Morgue, known to be the sole occupancy of Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter, Mademoiselle Camille L'Espanaye. After some delay, occasioned by a fruitless attempt to procure admission into the usual manner, the gateway was broken in with a crowbar, and 8 or 10 of the neighbors entered, accompanied by 2 gendarmes. By this time, the cries had ceased. But as the party rushed up to the first flight of stairs, 2 or more rough voices in angry contention were distinguished, and seemed to be proceeding from the upper part of the house. As the second landing was reached, these sounds also had ceased, and everything remained perfectly quiet. The party spread themselves and hurried from room to room upon arriving at a large back chamber in the 4th story, the door of which, being found locked with the key inside, was forced open. A spectacle presented itself which struck every one present, not less with horror than with astonishment. The apartment was in the wildest disorder, the furniture broken and thrown in all about directions. There was only one bedstead, and from this the bed had been removed and thrown into the middle of the floor. On a chair lay a razor, besmeared with blood. On the hearth were 2 or 3 long and thick tresses of gray human hair, also dabbled in blood and seeming to have been pulled out by the roots. Upon the floor were found 4 Napoleons, an earring of topaz, 3 large silver spoons, 3 smaller metal d'Alger, and 2 bags containing nearly 4,000 francs in gold. The drawers of a bureau, which stood in one corner, were open and had been apparently rifled, although many articles still remained in them. A small iron safe was discovered under the bed, not under the bedstead. It was open, with a key still in the door. It had no contents beyond a few old letters and other papers of little consequence. Of Madame L'Espanaye, no traces were seen, but an unusual quantity of soot being observed in the fireplace, a search was made in the chimney, and, horrible to relate, the corpse of the daughter, head downward, was dragged therefrom, it having been thus forced up the narrow aperture from a considerable distance. The body was quite warm. Upon examining it, many excoriations were perceived, no doubt occasioned by the violence with which it had been thrust up and disengaged. Upon the face were many severe scratches, and upon the throat dark bruises and deep indentations of fingernails, as if the deceased had been throttled to death. And after a thorough investigation of every portion of the house, without further discovery, the party made its way into a small paved yard in the rear of the building, where lay the corpse of the old lady, with her throat so entirely cut that, upon an attempt to raise her, the head fell off and rolled some distance. The body, as well as the head, was fearfully mutilated, the former so much so as scarcely to retain any semblance of humanity. To this horrible mystery there is not as yet, we believe, the slightest clue. The next day's paper had these additional particulars. The tragedy at Rue Morgue. The tragedy in the Rue Morgue. Many individuals have been examined in relation to this most extraordinary and frightful affair. The word affair has not yet, in France, the levity of import which it conveys with us. But nothing whatever has transpired to throw light upon it. We give below all the material testimony elicited. Pauline de Bourg, laundress, deposes that she has known both the deceased for 3 years, having washed for them during that period. The old lady and her daughter seemed on good terms, very affectionate towards each other. They were excellent pay, could not speak in regard to their mode or means of living, believed that Madame L. told fortunes for a living, was reputed to have money put by, never met any persons in the house when she called for the clothes or took them home, was sure that they had no servant in the employ. There appeared to be no furniture in any part of the building except the fourth story. Pierre Moreau, tobacconist, deposes that he had been in the habit of selling small quantities of tobacco and snuff to Madame L'Espanaye for nearly 4 years, was born in the neighborhood, and has always resided there. The deceased and her daughter had occupied the house in which the corpses were found for more than 6 years. It was formerly occupied by a jeweler who underlet the upper rooms to various persons. The house was property of Madame L. She became dissatisfied with the abuse of the premises by her tenant and moved into them herself, refusing to let any portion. The old lady was childish. Witness had seen the daughter some 5 or 6 times during the 6 years. The two lived an exceedingly retired life, were reputed to have money, had heard it said among the neighbors that Madame L. told fortunes, did not believe it, had never seen any person enter the door except the old lady and the daughter, a porter once or twice, and a physician some 8 or 10 times. Many other persons and neighbors gave evidence to the same effect. No one was spoken of as frequenting the house. It was not known whether there were any living connections of Madame L. and her daughter. The shutters of the front windows were seldom opened. Those in the rear were always closed, with the exception of the large black room, 4th story. The house was a good house, not very old. Isidore Musset, gendarme, deposes that he was called to the house at about 3 o'clock in the morning and found some 20 or 30 persons at the gateway, endeavoring to gain admittance. Forced it open at length with a bayonet, not a crowbar. Had but little difficulty getting it open, on account of it being a double or folding gate, and bolted neither at the bottom nor the top. The shrieks were continued until the gate was forced, and then suddenly ceased. They seemed to be screams of some person or persons in great agony. They were loud and drawn out, not short and quick. Witness led up the way upstairs. Upon reaching the first landing, hearing the 2 voices in loud and angry contention, the one a gruff voice, the other much shriller, a very strange voice, could distinguish some words of the former, which was that of the Frenchman. Was positive that it was not a woman's voice. Could distinguish the words sacre and diable. The shrill voice was that of a foreigner. Could not be sure whether it was the voice of a man or woman. Could not make out what was said, but believed the language to be Spanish. The state of the room and the bodies were described by the witness as we described them yesterday. Henri Duval, a neighbor, and by trade a silversmith, deposes that he was one of the party who first entered the house. Corroborates the testimony of Musset in general. As soon as they forced an entrance, they reclosed the door to keep out the crowd, which collected very fast, notwithstanding the lateness of the hour. The shrill voice, the witness thinks, was that of an Italian. Was certain it was not French. Could not be sure that it was a man's voice. It might have been a woman's. Was not acquainted with the Italian language. Could not distinguish the words, but was convinced by the intonation that the speaker was an Italian. Knew Madame L. and her daughter. Had conversed with both frequently. Was sure that the shrill voice was not that of either of the deceased. Audenheimer, a restaurateur. This witness volunteered his testimony. Not speaking French, was examined through an interpreter. Is a native of Amsterdam. Was passing the house at the time of the shrieks. They lasted several minutes, probably 10. They were long and loud, very awful and distressing. Was one of those who entered the building. Corroborated the previous evidence in every respect but one. Was sure that the shrill voice was that of a man, of a Frenchman. Could not distinguish the words uttered. They were loud and quick, unequal, sometimes quick, sometimes deliberate, spoken apparently in fear as well as anger. The voice was harsh, not so much shrill as harsh. Could not call it a shrill voice. The gruff voice said repeatedly, Sacré diable, and once, Mon Dieu. Jules Mangard, banker of the firm Mangard et Fils, Rue de Lorraine, is the elder Megnaud. Madame L'Espanaye had some property, had opened an account with his banking house of the spring of the year, 8 years previously, made frequent deposits in small sums, had checked for nothing until the 3rd day before her death, when she took out in person the sum of 4,000 francs. The sum was paid in gold, and a clerk was sent home with the money. Adolphe Lebon, clerk to Megnaud et Fils, deposes that on the day in question, at about noon, he accompanied Madame L'Espanaye to her residence with 4,000 francs, put up into 2 bags. Upon the door being opened, Mademoiselle L. appeared and took from his hands one of the bags, while the old lady relieved him of the other. He then bowed and departed. He did not see any person in the streets at the time. It is a by-street, very lonely. William Bird, tailor, deposes that he was one of the party who entered the house, is an Englishman, has lived in Paris 2 years, was one of the first to ascend the stairs, heard the voices in contention. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman. Could make out several words, but cannot remember all. Heard distinctly, Sacré et mon Dieu. There was a sound at the moment as if several persons are struggling, a scraping and a scuffling sound. The shrill voice was very loud, louder than the gruff one. Is sure that it was not the voice of an Englishman. Appeared to be that of German. Might have been a woman's voice. Does not understand German. Four of the above-named witnesses, being recalled, deposed that the door to the chamber which found the body of Mademoiselle L. was locked on the inside when the party reached it. Everything was perfectly silent. No groans or noises of any kind. Upon forcing the door, no person was seen. The windows, both of the back and the front room, were down and firmly fastened from within. A door between the 2 rooms was closed, but not locked. The door leading from the front room into the passage was locked with the key on the inside. A small room in the front of the house, on the 4th story, at the head of the passage, was open, the door being ajar. This room was crowded with old beds, boxes, and so forth. These were carefully removed and searched. There was not an inch of any portion of the house which was not carefully searched. Sweeps were sent up and down the chimneys. The house was a 4-story one, with garrets. A trap door on the roof was nailed down very securely. Did not appear to have been opened for years. The time elapsing between the hearing of the voices in contention and the breaking open of the room door was variously stated by the witnesses. Some made it as short as 3 minutes, some as long as 5. The door was opened with difficulty. Alfonso Garcia, undertaker, deposes that he resides in the Rue Morgue, is a native of Spain, was one of the party who entered the house, did not proceed upstairs, is nervous, and was apprehensive of the consequences of agitation. Heard voices in contention. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman. Could not distinguish what he said. The shrill voice was that of an Englishman. Is sure of this. Does not understand the English language, but judges by the intonation. Alberto Montani, a confectioner, deposes that he was among the first to ascend the stairs. heard the voices in question. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman. Distinguished several words, the speaker appeared to be expostulating. Could not make out the words of the shrill voice. Spoke quick and unevenly. Thinks it the voice of a Russian. Corroborates the general testimony. Is an Italian. Never conversed with a native of Russia. Several witnesses recalled here testify that the chimneys of all the rooms of the fourth story were too narrow to admit passage of a human being. By sweeps were meant cylindrical sweeping brushes, such as are employed by those who clean chimneys. These brushes were passed up and down every flue in the house. There is no back passage by which anyone could have descended while the party proceeded up the stairs. The body of Mademoiselle L'Espanaye was so firmly wedged in the chimney that it could not be got down until 4 or 5 of their party united their strength. Paul Dumas, a physician, deposes that he was called to view the bodies at daybreak. They were both then lying on the sacking of the bedstead in the chamber where Mademoiselle L. was found. The corpse of the young lady was much bruised and excoriated. The fact that it had been thrust up the chimney was sufficiently account for these appearances. The throat was greatly chafed. There were several deep scratches just below the chin, together with a series of livid spots which were evidently the impression of fingers. The face was fearfully discolored, and the eyeballs protruded. The tongue had been partially bitten through. A large bruise was discovered upon the pit of the stomach, produced apparently by pressure of a knee. In the opinion of Mr. Dumas, Mademoiselle L'Espanaye had been throttled to death by some person or persons unknown. The corpse of the mother was horribly mutilated. All the bones of the right leg and arm were more or less shattered, the left tibia much splintered, as well as the ribs of the left side. The whole body dreadfully bruised and discolored. It was not possible to say how the injuries had been inflicted. A heavy club of wood or a broad bar of iron, a chair, any large, heavy, and obtuse weapon would have produced such a result, if wielded by the hands of a very powerful man. No woman could have inflicted these blows with any weapon. The head of the deceased was seen by witnesses, was entirely separated from the body, and was greatly shattered. The throat had evidently been cut with some very sharp instrument, probably a razor. Nothing of farther importance was elicited, although several other persons were examined. A murder so mysterious and perplexing in all its particulars had never been committed in Paris, if indeed a murder had been committed at all. The police are entirely at fault, an unusual occurrence in affairs of this nature. There is not, however, the shadow of a clue apparent. The evening edition of the paper stated that the greatest excitement still continued in the Quartier de Saint-Rouge, that the premises in question had been carefully researched and fresh examinations of witnesses instituted, but all to no purpose. A postscript, however, mentioned that Adolphe Lebon had been arrested and imprisoned, although nothing appeared to criminate him beyond the facts already detailed. Dupin seemed singularly interested in the progress of this affair. At least so I judged from his manner, for he made no comments whatsoever. It was only after the announcement that Lebon had been imprisoned that he asked me my opinion respecting it. I could merely agree with all of Paris in considering it an insoluble mystery. I saw no means by which it could be possible to trace the murderer. We must not judge of the means, said Dupin, by this shell of an examination. The Parisian police, so much extolled for acumen, are cunning, but no more. There is no method in their proceedings beyond the method of the moment. They make a vast parade of measures, but not unfrequently these are so illy adapted to the objects proposed as to put us in the mind of Monsieur Jourdain's calling for his robe de chambre, pour mieux entendre la musique. The results attained by them are not unfrequently surprising, but, for the most part, are brought about by simple diligence and activity. When these quantities are unavailing, their schemes fail. Vidocq, for example, was a good guesser and a persevering man. But without educated thought, he erred continuously the very intensity of his investigations. He impaired his vision by holding the object too close. He might see, perhaps, one or two points with unusual clearness, but in so doing, he necessarily lost sight of the matter as a whole. Thus, there is such a thing as being too profound. Truth is not always in a well. In fact, as regards the more important knowledge, I do believe that she is invariably superficial. The depth lies in the valleys where we seek her, and not upon the mountaintops where she is found. The modes and sources of this kind of error are well typified in the contemplation of the heavenly bodies. To look at a star by glances, to view it in a sidelong way by turning toward the exterior portions of the retina, more susceptible of a feeble impression of light than the interior, is to behold the star distinctly, is to have the best appreciation of its luster, a luster which grows dim just in proportion as we turn our vision fully upon it. A greater number of rays actually fall upon the eye in the latter case. But in the former, there is a more refined capacity for comprehension. By undue profundity, we perplex and enfeeble thought, and it is possible to make even Venus herself vanish from the firmament by a scrutiny too sustained, too concentrated, and too direct. As for these murders, let us enter into some examinations for ourselves before we make an opinion respecting them. An inquiry will afford us amusement. I thought this an odd term, so applied, but said nothing. And besides, Laban once rendered me a service for which I am not ungrateful. We will go and see the premises with our own eyes. I know G, the preferred to police, and shall have no difficulty in obtaining the necessary permission. This permission was obtained, and we proceeded at once to Rue Morgue. This is one of those miserable thoroughfares which intervene between the Rue Richelieu and the Rue Saint-Roch. It was late in the afternoon when we reached it, for this quarter is at a great distance from that which we resided. The house we readily found, for there were still many persons gazing upon those closed shutters with an abjectless curiosity from the opposite side of the way. It was an ordinary Parisian house with a gateway on one side of which was a glazed watch-box with a sliding panel in the window, indicating a loge de concierge. Before going in, we walked the street, turned down an alley, and then, again turning, passed in the rear of the building. Dupin, meanwhile, examining the whole neighborhood as well as the house, with the minuteness of attention for which I could see no possible object. Retracing our steps, we came again to the front of the dwelling, rang, and having shown our credentials, were admitted by the agents in charge. We went upstairs into the chamber where the body of Mademoiselle L'Espanaye had been found, and where both the deceased still lay. The disorders of the room had, as usual, been suffered to exist. I saw nothing beyond what had been stated in the tribunal. Dupin scrutinized everything, not excepting the bodies of the victims. We then went into the other rooms and into the yard, a gendarme accompanying us throughout. Our examination occupied us until dark, when we took our departure. On our way home, my companion stepped in for a moment at the office of one of the daily papers. I have said that the whims of my friend were manifold, and that je les ménageais, For this phrase, there is no English equivalent. It was his humor now to decline all conversation on the subject of the murder until after we had taken a bottle of wine together about noon the next day. He asked me, suddenly, if I had observed anything peculiar at the scene of the atrocity. There was something in his manner of emphasizing the word peculiar, which caused me to shudder, without knowing why. No, nothing peculiar, I said. Nothing more, at least, than we both saw stated in the paper. Le Tribunal, he replied, has not entered, I fear, into the unusual horror of the thing. But we will not revert to the idle opinions of this print. It appears to me that the mystery is considered insoluble for the very reason which should cause it to be regarded as easy of solution. I mean, for the outre character of its features. The police are confounded by the seeming absence of motive, not for the murder itself, but for the atrocity of the murder. They are puzzled by the seeming impossibility of reconciling the voices heard in contention with the fact that no one was discovered upstairs but the assassinated Mademoiselle Espagnier, and that there were no means of egress without the notice of the party ascending. The wild disorder of the rooms, the corpse thrust with the head downward up the chimney, the frightful mutilation of the body of the old lady. These considerations, with those just mentioned, and others which I need not mention, have sufficed to paralyze the powers, by putting completely at fault the boasted acumen of the government agents. They have fallen into the gross but common error of confounding the usual with the abstruse. But it is by these deviations from the plane of the ordinary that reason feels the way, if at all, in its searches after the true. In investigations such as we are now pursuing, it should not be so much asked what is occurred as what has occurred which has never occurred before. In fact, the facility with which I shall arrive, or have arrived, at the solution of this mystery is in exact ratio with its apparent insolubility in the eyes of the police. I stared at the speaker in mute astonishment. He continued. I am now awaiting, continued he, looking toward the door of our apartment. I am now awaiting a person who, although perhaps not the perpetrator of these butcheries, must have been in some measure implicated in their perpetration. Of the worst portions of these crimes committed is the probable that he is innocent. I hope that I am right in this supposition, for upon it I build my expectation of reading the entire riddle. I look for the man here, in this room, every moment. It is true that he may not arrive, but the probability is that he will. Should he come, it will be necessary to detain him. Here are pistols, and we both know how to use them when occasion demands their use. I took the pistol, scarcely knowing what I did or believing what I heard, while Dupin went on, very much as if a soliloquy. I have already spoken of his abstract manner at such times. His discourse was addressed to myself, but his voice, although by no means loud, had the intonation which is commonly employed to speaking of someone at a great distance. His eyes, vacant in expression, regarded only the wall. That the voices heard in contention, he said, by the party upon the stairs were not the voices of women themselves, was fully proved by the evidence. This relieves us of all doubt upon the question of whether that old lady could have first destroyed the daughter and afterwards committed suicide. I speak to this point chiefly for the sake of method. For the strength of Madame L'Espanaye would have been utterly unequal to the task of thrusting her daughter's corpse upon the chimney as it was found. And the nature of the wounds upon her own person entirely preclude the idea of self-destruction. Murder, then, has been committed by some third party, and the voices of this third party were heard in the contention. Let me now advert, not to the whole testimony respecting these voices, but to what was particular in that testimony. Did you observe anything peculiar about it? I remarked that, while all the witnesses agreed in supposing the gruff voice to be that of a Frenchman, there was much disagreement in regard to the shrill, or as one individual termed it, the harsh voice. That was the evidence itself, said Dupin. But it was not the peculiarity of the evidence. You have observed nothing distinctive. Re-employing my own words, I may say that you have pointed out no prominence above the plane of the ordinary, by which reason may feel her way. Yet there was something to be pointed out. The witnesses, as you remark, agreed about the gruff voice. They were here unanimous. But in regard to the shrill voice, the peculiarity is not that they disagreed, but that while an Italian, Englishman, a Spaniard, a Hollander, and a Frenchman attempted to describe it, each one spoke of it as that of a foreigner. Each is sure that it was not the voice of one of his own countrymen. Each likens it not to the voice of an individual of any nation with whose language he is conversant, but the converse. The Frenchman supposes it is the voice of a Spaniard, and might have distinguished some words had he been acquainted with the Spanish. The Dutchman maintains it is to have been that of a Frenchman, but we find it stated that, not understanding French, this witness was examined through an interpreter. The Englishman thinks it is the voice of a German and does not understand German. The Spaniard is sure that it was that of an Englishman, but judges by the intonation altogether, as he has no knowledge of the English language. The Italian believes it was the voice of a Russian, but has never conversed with a native Russian. A second Frenchman differs, moreover, with the first, and is positive that the voice was that of an Italian, but not being cognizant of that tongue, is, like the Spaniard, convinced by the intonation. Now, how strangely unusual must that voice have really been, about which such a testimony as this could have been elicited, in whose tone even denizens of the 5 great divisions of Europe could recognize nothing familiar? You will say that it might have been the voice of an Asiatic or of an African. Neither Asiatics nor Africans abound in Paris, but, without denying the inference, I will just now merely call your attention to 3 points which have relation to this topic. The voice is termed by one witness harsh rather than shrill. It is represented by 2 others as having been quick and unequal. No words, no sound resembling words, where by any witness mentioned it as indistinguishable. I know not, continued Dupin, what impression I may have made so far upon your own understanding, but I do not hesitate to say that legitimate deductions, even from this portion of the testimony, the portion respecting the gruff and shrill voices, are in themselves sufficient to engender a suspicion which should bias, or give the direction to all further progress of the investigation of the mystery. I said legitimate deductions, but my meaning is not thus fully expressed. I designed to imply that the deductions were the sole proper ones, and that the suspicion arose inevitably from them as a single result. What the suspicion is, however, I will not say just yet. I merely wish you to bear in mind that with myself it was sufficiently forcible to give a definite form, a certain tendency, to my inquiries in the chamber. Let us now transport ourselves, in fancy, to that chamber. What shall we seek first here? The means of egress employed by the murderers. It is not too much to say that we neither of us believe the preternatural events. Madame and Mademoiselle L'Espanaye were not destroyed by spirits. The doers of the dark deed were material and escaped materially. Then how? Fortunately, there is but one mode of reasoning upon this point, and that mode must lead us to a definite decision. Let us examine, each by each, the possible means of egress. It is clear that the assassins were found in the room where Mademoiselle L'Espanaye was found, or at least in the room adjoining when the party ascended the stairs. It is then only from these two apartments that we have to seek for the issues. The police have laid bare the floor, the ceilings, the masonry of the walls in every direction. No secret issues could have escaped their vigilance. But not trusting to their own eyes, I examined with my own. There were, then, no secret issues. Both doors leading from the rooms to the passage were securely locked, with the keys inside. Well, let us turn to the chimney. These, although of ordinary width for some 8 or 10 feet above the hearths, will not admit, through their extent, the body of a large cat. The impossibility of egress means already stated being thus absolute. We are reduced to the windows. Through those of the front room, nobody could have escaped without notice from the crowd in the street. The murderers must have passed then through those of the back room. Now, brought to this conclusion in so unequivocal a manner as we are, it is not our part as reasoners to reject it on account of apparent impossibilities. It is only left for us to prove that these impossibilities are not such. There are 2 windows in the chamber. One of them is obstructed by furniture and is wholly visible. The lower portion of the other one is hidden from view. Oh, wait a minute. I think I said obstructed. Let me go back. There are 2 windows in the chamber. One of them is unobstructed by furniture and is wholly visible. The lower portion of the other is hidden from view by the head of the unwieldy bedstead, which is thrust close up against it. The former was found securely fastened from within. It resisted to the utmost force those endeavored to raise it. A large gimlet hole had been pierced in its frame to the left, and a very stout nail was found fitted therein nearly to the head. Upon examining the other window, a similar nail was seen similarly fitted in it, and a vigorous attempt to raise this sash failed also. The police were now entirely satisfied that egress had not been in these directions, and therefore it was thought a manner of supererogation to withdraw the nails and open the windows. My own examination was somewhat more particular, and was so for the reason I have just given, because here it was. I knew that all apparent impossibilities must be proved to not be such in reality. I proceeded to think a posteriori. The murderers did escape from one of these windows. This being so, they could not have refastened the sashes from the inside, as they were found fastened. The consideration which would put a stop, through its obviousness, to the scrutiny of the police in this quarter. Yet the sashes were fastened. They must then have the power of fastening themselves. There was no escape from this conclusion. I stepped to the unobstructed casement, withdrew the nail with some difficulty, and attempted to raise the sash. It resisted all of my efforts, as I had anticipated. A concealed spring must, I now knew, exist, and the corroboration of my idea convinced me that my premises, at least, were correct. However mysterious still appeared the circumstances attending the nails. A careful search soon brought to light the hidden spring. I pressed it and, satisfied with the discovery, forbore to upraise the sash. I now replaced the nail and regarded it attentively. A person passing out through this window might have reclosed it, and the spring would have caught. But the nail could not have been replaced. The conclusion was plain, and again narrowed in the field of my investigations. The assassins must have escaped through the other window. Supposing, then, the springs upon which each sash seemed to be the same, as was probable, there must be found a difference between the nails, or at least between the modes of their fixture. Getting upon the sacking of the bedstead, I looked over the headboard minutely at the second casement. Passing my hands down between the board, I readily discovered and pressed the spring, which was, as I had supposed, identical in character with its nature. I now looked at the nail. It was as stout as the other, and apparently fitted in the same manner, driven in nearly up to the head. You will say I was puzzled, but if you think I must have misunderstood the nature of the inductions. To use a sporting phrase, I had not been once at fault. The scent had never for an instant been lost. There was no flaw in any link of the chain. I had traced the secret to its ultimate result, and that result was the nail. I had, I say, in every respect the appearance of its fellow in the other window, but the fact was an absolute nullity, conclusive as it might seem to be, when compared with the consideration that here, at this point, terminated the clue. There must be something wrong, I said, about that nail. I touched it, and the head, with about 1/8 of an inch of the shank, came off in my fingers. The rest of the shank was in the gimlet hole, where it had been broken off. The fracture was an old one, for its edges were encrusted in rust, and had apparently been accompanied by the blow of a hammer, which had partially embedded it in the top of the sash. The head portion of the nail I now carefully replaced, this head portion to the indentation whence I had taken it, and the resemblance to the perfect nail was complete. I gently raised the sash for a few inches. The head went up with it, remaining firm in its bed. I closed the window, and the semblance of the whole nail was perfect again. The riddle so far was now unriddled. The assassins had escaped through the window which looked upon the bed, dropping of its own accord upon their exit, or perhaps purposely closed by them. It had become fastened by the spring, and it was the retention of this spring which had been mistaken by the police for that of the nail, farther inquiry being thus considered unnecessary. The next question is that of the mode of descent. Upon the point I had been satisfied with my walk with you around the building. About 5 feet and a half from the casement in question, there ran a lightning rod. From this rod, it would have been impossible for anyone to reach the window itself, to say nothing of entering it. I observed, however, that the shutters of the 4th story were particular kind called by Parisian carpenters ferrades, a kind rarely employed at the present day, but frequently seen upon very old mansions at Lyon and Bordeaux. They are in the form of ordinary door, a single, not folding door, except that the lower half is latticed or worked in open trellis, thus affording an excellent hold for hands. In the present instance, these shutters are fully 3 feet and a half broad. When we saw them from the rear of the house, they were both about half open. That is to say, they stood off at right angles of the wall. It is probable that the police, as well as myself, examined the tenement, but if so, in looking at these ferrades in the line of their breadth, as they must have done, they did not perceive this great breadth itself, or, at all events, failed to take it into due consideration. In fact, having once satisfied themselves that no egress could have been made in this quarter, they would naturally bestow here a very cursory examination. It was clear to me, however, that the shutter belonging to the window at the head of the bed would, if swung fully back to the wall, reach within 2 feet of the lightning rod. And it was also evident that, by exertion of a very unusual degree of activity and courage, an entrance into the window from the rod might have been thus effected. By reaching to the distance of 2.5 feet, we now suppose that the shutter opened to its whole extent. A robber might have taken a firm grasp upon the trellis work, letting go, then his hold upon the rod, placing his feet firmly against the wall and springing boldly from it. He might have swung the shutter so as to close it, and, if we imagine the window open at the time, might have swung himself into the room. I wish you to bear especially in mind that I have spoken of a very unusual degree of activity as requisite to success in so hazardous a difficult feat. It is my design to show you, first, that this thing might possibly have been accomplished, but secondly, and chiefly, I wish to impress upon your understanding the very extraordinary, the almost preternatural character of that agility which could have accomplished it. You will say, no doubt, using the language of the law, that to make out my case, I should rather undervalue than insist upon a full estimation of the activity required in this matter. This may be practiced by law, but it is not the usage of my reason. My ultimate object is only the truth. My immediate purpose is to lead you to the place in juxtaposition that very unusual activity which I have just spoken, with that very peculiar shrill or harsh and unequal voice, whose nationality no two persons could be found to agree, and whose utterance no syllabification could be detected. At these words, a vague and half-formed concept of the meaning of Dupin flitted over my mind. I seemed to be upon the verge of comprehension, without power to comprehend, as men at times find themselves upon the brink of remembrance, without being able, in the end, to remember. My friend went on with his discourse. You see, he said, that I have shifted the question from the mode of egress to that of ingress. It was my design to convey the idea that both effected in the same manner at the same point. Let us now revert, in fancy, to the interior of the room. Let us survey the appearances here. The drawers of the bureau, it is said, had been rifled, although many articles of apparel still remained within them. The conclusion here is absurd. It is a mere guess, a very silly one, and no more. How are we to know the articles found in the drawers were not all these drawers had originally been contained? Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter lived an exceedingly retired life, saw no company, seldom went out, and had little use for numerous changes of habiliment. Those found were at least of as good quality as any likely to be possessed by these ladies. If a thief had taken any, why would he not take the best? Why did he not take it all? In a word, why did he abandon 4,000 francs in gold to encumber himself with a bundle of linen? The gold was abandoned. Nearly the whole sum mentioned by Monsieur Mignot, the banker, was discovered in bags upon the floor. I wish you, therefore, to discard your thoughts of the blundering idea of motive engendered in the brains of the police by that portion of evidence which speaks of money delivered to the door of the house. Coincidences 10 times as remarkable as this, the delivery of the money, and the murder committed within 3 days of the party receiving it, happen at each and every one of us every hour of our lives without attracting even a momentary notice. Coincidences in general are great stumbling blocks in the way of that class of thinkers who have been educated to know nothing and to care less of the theory of probabilities, that theory of which the most glorious objects of human research are indebted for the most glorious of illustration. In the present instance, had the gold been gone, the fact that the delivery 3 days before would have formed something more than a coincidence. It would have been corroborative of this idea of motive. But, under the real circumstances of the case, If we are to suppose gold the motive of this outrage, we must also imagine the perpetrator so vacillating an idiot as to have abandoned his gold and his motive altogether. Keeping steadily in mind the points to which I have drawn your attention, the particular voice, the unusual agility, and that startling absence of a motive in murder so singularly atrocious as this, let us glance at the butchery itself. Here is a woman strangled to death by manual strength and thrust up a chimney head downward. Ordinary assassins employ no such modes of murder as this. Least of all do they thus dispose of the murdered. In the manner of thrusting the corpse up the chimney, you will admit that there is something excessively outre, something altogether irreconcilable with our common notions of human action. Even when we suppose the actors of the most depraved of men. Think, too, what must have been the degree of strength which could thrust the body up an aperture so forcefully that the united vigor of several persons was found barely sufficient to drag it down. Turn now to other indications of the employment of vigor most marvelous. On the hearth were thick tresses, very thick tresses of gray human hair. These had been torn out by the roots. You are aware of the great force of tearing thus from the head even 20 or 30 hairs altogether. You saw the locks in question as well as myself. Their roots, a hideous sight, were clotted with fragments of the flesh of the scalp. Sure token of the prodigious power which had been exerted in uprooting perhaps 1,000,000 hairs at a time. The throat of the old lady was not merely cut, but the head was severed from the body. The instrument was a mere razor. Here again we have evidence of the vastness of strength upon which I would affix your attention. I wish you to also look, and to look steadily, at the brutal ferocity of these deeds. Of the bruises upon Madame L'Espanaye I do not speak. Monsieur Dumas and his worthy coadjutor, Monsieur Etienne, have pronounced that they were inflicted by some obtuse instrument. And so far these gentlemen are very correct. The obtuse instrument was clearly a stone pavement in the yard, which the victim had fallen from the window looked upon in the bed. This idea, however simple it may seem, escaped the police for the same reason that the breadth of the shutters escaped them, because, by the affair of nails, their perception had been hermetically sealed against the possibility of the window having ever been opened at all. If now, in addition to all of these things, you have properly reflected upon the odd disorder of the chamber, we have gone so far as to combine the ideas of a strength superhuman, an agility astounding, a ferocity brutal, a butchery without motive, a grotesque horror absolutely alien from humanity, and a voice foreign in tone to the ears of men of many nations, and devoid of all distinct or intelligible syllabification. What result, then, has ensued? What impression have I made upon your fancy? I shuddered as Dupin asked me this question. A madman, I said, has done this deed. Some raving maniac escaped from a neighboring maison de santé. In some respects, he replied, your idea is not irrelevant. But the voices of madmen, even in their wildest paroxysms, are never found to tally with the particular voice heard upon the stairs. Madmen are of some nation, and their language, however incoherent in words, has always the coherence of syllabification. Besides, the hair of a madman is not such hair as I now hold on my head. I disentangled this little tuft from across the tresses remaining upon the head of Madame L'Espanaye. Tell me what you make of it. Good God, I said, completely unnerved. This hair is most unusual. This is no human hair. I have not asserted that it was. But before we decide upon this point, I wish you to glance at the little sketch which I have here traced upon this paper. It is a facsimile drawing of what has been described in one portion of the testimony as dark bruises and deep indentations of fingernails upon the throat of Madame L'Espanaye, and in another by Monsieur Dumas and Etienne as a series of livid spots, evidently the impression of fingers. You will perceive, continued my friend, spreading out the paper upon the table before us. You will perceive this drawing gives the idea of a firm and fixed hold. There is no slipping apparent. Each finger has retained the possibly until the death of the victim, the fearful grasp by which it originally embedded itself. Attempt now to place all your fingers at one and the same time, the impressions as you see them. I made the attempt in vain. We are possibly not giving this matter a fair trial, he said. The paper is spread out upon the plain surface, but the human throat is cylindrical. Here is a billet of wood, the circumference of which is about that of the throat. Wrap the drawing around it and try the experiment again. I did so, but the difficulty was even more obvious than before. This, I said, is the mark of no human man. Assuredly it is not, replied Dupin. Read now this passage from Cuvier. It was a minute anatomical and generally descriptive account of the large fulvous orangutan of the East Indian Islands. The gigantic structure, the prodigious strength and activity, the wild ferocity, and the imitative propensities of these mammalia are sufficiently well known to all. I understood the full horrors of the murder at once. The description of the digits, said I, as I made an end of the reading, is in exact accordance with this drawing. I see that no animal but an orangutan of the species here mentioned could have impressed the indentations as you have traced them. This tuft of yellow hair is identical in character to that of the beast of Cuvier, but I cannot possibly comprehend the particulars of this frightful mystery. Besides, there were two voices heard in contention, and one of them was unquestionably the voice of a Frenchman. True. And you will remember an expression attributed almost unanimously by the evidence to this voice. The expression, Mon Dieu! This, under the circumstances, had been justly characterized by one of the witnesses, Montani the confectioner, as an expression of remorse or expostulation. Upon these two words, therefore, I have mainly built my hopes of a full solution of the riddle. A Frenchman was cognizant of the murder. It is possible, indeed it is far more than probable, that he was innocent of all participation in the bloody transactions which took place. The orangutan may have escaped from him. He may have traced it to the chamber, but under the agitating circumstances which ensued, he could never have recaptured it. It is still at large. I will not pursue these guesses, for I have no right to call them more than guesses. But since the shades of reflection upon which they are based are scarcely of sufficient depth to be appreciable by my own intellect, and since I could not pretend to make them intelligible to the understanding of another than myself, we will call them guesses then, and speak of them as such. If the Frenchman in question be indeed, as I suppose, innocent of this atrocity, the advertisement which I left last night upon our return home, at the office of Le Monde, a paper devoted to the shipping interest and much sought for by sailors, will bring him to our residence. He handed me the paper, and I read thus. Caught. in the Bois de Boulogne early in the morning of the morning of the murder. A very large tawny-colored orangutan of the Bornese species. The owner, who is asserted to be a sailor belonging to a Maltese vessel, may have the animal again upon identifying it satisfactorily and paying a few charges arising from its capture and keeping. Call at this number and this rue, Faubourg Saint-Germain, à Tourmesé. How is that possible, I asked, that you should know the man to be a sailor and belonging to the Maltese vessel? I did not know it. I am not sure of it. Here, however, is a small piece of ribbon, which has evidently, from its form and from its greasy appearance, been used in laying the hair of one of these long queues of which sailors are so fond. Moreover, the knot is one with which few sailors can tie, and is peculiar to the Maltese. I picked the ribbon up at the foot of the lightning rod. It could not have belonged to either of the deceased. Now, if, after all, I am wrong in my induction from this ribbon that the Frenchman was a sailor belonging to the Maltese vessel, still I can have done no harm in stating what I did in the advertisement. If I am in error, he will merely suppose that I have been misled by some circumstance into which he will not take the trouble to inquire. But if I am right, a great point is gained. Cognizant of the murder, although not guilty, the Frenchman will naturally hesitate about replying to the advertisement about demanding the orangutan. He will thus, I am innocent, I am poor, my orangutan is of great value to one of my circumstances, a fortune of itself. Why should I lose it through idle apprehensions of danger? Here it is within my grasp. It was found in the Bois de Boulogne, at a vast distance from the scene of that butchery. How can it even be suspected that a brute beast should have done the deed? The police are at fault. They have failed to procure the slightest clue. Should they even trace the animal, it would be impossible to prove me cognizant of the murder or implicate me in the guilt on the account of that cognizance. Above all, I am known. The advertiser designates me as the possessor of the beast. I am not sure what limit his knowledge may extend. Should I avoid claiming the property of so great a value, which is known that I possess? I will render the animal at least liable to suspicion. It is not my policy to attract attention either to myself or the beast. I will answer the advertisement, get the orangutan, and keep it close until this matter is blown over. At this moment, we heard a step on the stairs. Be ready, said Dupin, with your pistol, but neither show them nor use them until a signal from myself. The front door of the house had been left open, and the visitor had entered without ringing or rapping, and advanced several steps on the staircase. Now, however, he seemed to hesitate. Presently we heard him descending. Dupin was moving quickly to the door when we heard him again coming up. He did not turn back a second time, but stepped up quickly and rapped at the door of our chamber. Come in, said Dupin in a cheerful and hearty tone. The visitor entered. He was a sailor, evidently, a tall, stout, and muscular-looking guy with a certain daredevil expression of countenance, not altogether unprepossessing. Sorry. His face, greatly sunburned, was more than half hidden by a world of whisker and mustachio. He had with him a huge oaken cudgel, but appeared to be otherwise unarmed. He bowed awkwardly and bade us good evening in French accents, which, although somewhat Neufchâtel-ish, were still sufficiently indicative of a Parisian origin. Sit down, my friend, said Dupin. I suppose you have called about the orangutan. Upon my word, I almost envy you the possession of him. A remarkably fine and no doubt very valuable animal. How old do you suppose him to be? The sailor drew a long breath with the air of man, relieved of some intolerable burden, and then replied in an assured tone, I have no way of telling, but he can't be more than 4 or 5 years old. Have you got him here? Oh, no. We had no conveniences for keeping him here. He is at a livery stable in the Rue du Bourg, just by. You can get him in the morning. Of course, you are prepared to identify the property? Well, to be sure I am, sir. I should be very sorry to part with him, said Dupin. Well, I don't mean that you should be at all this trouble for nothing, sir, said the man. Couldn't expect it. I'm very willing to pay a reward for finding the animal. Well, that is to say, any reward in reason. Well, replied my friend, that is very fair, to be sure. Let me think. What reward ought I to have? Oh, I will tell you. My reward shall be this. You shall give me all the information in your power about the affair of the murder in the Rue Morgue. Dupin said these last words with a very low tone and very quietly. Just as quietly, too, he walked toward the door, locked it, and put the key in his pocket. He then drew a pistol from his bosom and placed it without the least flurry upon the table. The sailor's face flushed up with an ungovernable tide of crimson. He started to feel his feet and grasped for his cudgel, but the next moment he fell back into his seat, trembling convulsively, and with a countenance of death itself. He spoke not a single word. I pitied him from the bottom of my heart. My friend, said Dupin in a very kind tone, you are alarming yourself unnecessarily. You are indeed. We mean you no harm whatsoever. I pledge you the honor of a gentleman and of a Frenchman that we intend you no injury. I perfectly well know that you are innocent of the atrocities of the Rue Morgue. It will not do, however, to deny that you are in some measure implicated with them. From what I have already said, you must know that I have had means of information about this matter, means of which you could have never dreamed. Now, the thing stands thus. You have done nothing which you could have avoided, nothing, certainly, which renders you culpable. You are not even guilty of robbery when you might have robbed with impunity. You have nothing to conceal. You have no reason for concealment. On the other hand, you are bound by every principle of honor to confess all you know. An innocent man is now imprisoned, charged with a crime of which you could point out the perpetrator. The sailor recovered his presence of mind in a great measure, while Dupin uttered these words, but his original boldness of bearing was all gone. Oh, so help me God, he said in a brief pause. I will tell you what I know about this affair, but I do not expect you to believe one half of what I say. I would be a fool indeed if I did. Still, I am innocent, and I will make a clean breast of it if I die for it. I do not propose to follow the man in the circumstantial narrative which he now detailed. What he stated was, in substance, this. He had lately made a voyage to the Indian archipelago, a party of which he formed one landed at Borneo, and passed the interior on an excursion of pleasure. Himself and a companion had captured the orangutan. The companion dying, the animal fell into its own exclusive possession. After great trouble occasioned by the intractable ferocity of his captive during the home voyage, he at length succeeded in lodging it safely at his own residence in Paris, where, not to attract towards himself the unpleasant curiosity of his neighbors, he kept it carefully secluded until such a time it should recover from the wound in its foot, receiving a splinter on board of the ship. His ultimate design was to sell it. Returning home from sailor's frolic on the night, or rather in the morning of the murder, he found his prisoner occupying his own bedroom, into which he had broken from a closet adjoining, where he had been, as it was thought, securely contained. The beast, razor in hand, had fully lathered, was sitting before a looking-glass attempting the operation of shaving, in which he had no doubt previously witnessed his master through the keyhole of the closet. Terrified at the sight of so dangerous a weapon in possession of an animal, so furious, and so well able to use it, the man for some moments was at a loss of what to do. He had been accustomed, however, to the quiet creature, even in its fiercest moods, by the use of a strong wagoner's whip, and to this he now resorted. Upon sight of it, the orangutan sprang at once to the door of the chamber, down the stairs, and thence through a window, unfortunately open, into the street. The Frenchman followed in despair, the ape-razor still in hand, occasionally stopping to look back and gesticulate at his pursuer, until the latter had nearly come up with him. He then again made off. In this manner, the chase continued for a long time. The streets were profoundly quiet, and it was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. In passing down the alley in the rear of the Rue Morgue, the fugitive's attention was arrested by the light. The only one apparent except those of the town lamps, gleaming in the open window of Madame L'Espagnier's chamber in the 4th story of her house. Rushing to the building, he perceived the lightning rod, clambered up with the inconceivable agility, grasped the shutter, and was thrown fully back against the wall, and, by its means, swung himself directly upon the headboard of the bed. The whole feat did not occupy a minute. The shutter was kicked open again by the orangutan as he entered the room. The sailor, in the meantime, was both rejoiced and perplexed. He had strong hopes of now recapturing the ape, as it would scarcely escape from the trap into which it had ventured, except by the rod, where it might be intercepted as he came down. On the other hand, there was much cause for anxiety as to what the brute might do in the house. The latter reflection urged the man still to follow the fugitive. A lightning rod is ascended without difficulty, especially by a sailor. But when he had arrived at the high window, which lay far to his left, his career was stopped. The most that he could accomplish was to reach over so as to obtain a glimpse of the interior of the room. At this glimpse, he nearly fell from his hold through the excess of horror. Now it was that hideous shriek that arose in the night, which had startled from slumber the inmates of the Rue Morgue. Madame L'Espagne and her daughter, habited in their night clothes, had apparently been occupied in arranging some papers in the iron chest already mentioned, which had been wheeled into the middle of the room. It was open, and its contents lay beside it on the floor. Their backs must have been toward the window, and by the time elapsing between the screams and the ingress of the ape, it seems probable that he was not immediately perceived. The flapping to of the shutter would naturally have been attributed to the wind. As the sailor looked in, the gigantic beast had seized Madame L'Espagne by the hair, which was loose as she had been combing it, and was flourishing the razor about her face in imitation of the motions of a barber. The daughter lay prostrate and motionless. She had swooned. The screams and the struggles of the old lady, during which the hair was torn from her head, had the effect of changing the probably pacific purposes of the orangutan into those of an ungovernable wrath. With one determined sweep of his muscular arm, he nearly severed her head from her body. The sight of blood inflamed his anger into frenzy, gnashing his teeth and flashing fire from his eyes. He flew upon the body of the girl and embedded his fearful talons in her throat, retaining his grasp until she expired. His wandering and wild glances fell at the moment upon the head of the bed, over which those of his master, glazed in horror, were just discernible. The fury of the beast, who no doubt bore still in mind the dreaded whip, was instantly converted into dread. Conscious of having deserved punishment, he seemed desirous to conceal his bloody deeds, and skipped about the chamber in an apparent agony of nervous agitation, throwing down and breaking the furniture as he moved, and dragging the bed from the bedstead. In conclusion, he seized the first corpse of the daughter and thrust it up the chimney as it was found, then that of the old lady, which was rushed to the window, precipitating it immediately therefrom. As the ape approached him with his mutilated burden, the sailor shrank aghast to the rod, and rather gliding than clambering down, hurried at once home, dreading the consequences of the butchery and gladly abandoning it in his terror, all solicitude about the fate of the orangutan. The words heard by the party upon the staircase were the Frenchman's exclamation of horror and fright, commingled with the fiendish jabberings of the brute. I have scarcely anything to add. The orangutan must have escaped from the chamber by the rod, just before breaking the door. He must have closed the window as it passed through it. He was subsequently caught by the owner himself, who obtained for him a very large sum at the Jardin des Plantes. Le Bon was instantly released upon our narration of the circumstances, with some comments from Dupin, at the bureau of the Préfet de Police. This functionary, however, was well disposed to my friend, could not altogether conceal his chagrin at the turn which affairs had taken, and was fain to indulge in a sarcasm or two in regard to the propriety of every person minding his own business. "Let him talk," said Dupin, who had not thought it necessarily to reply. "Let him discourse. It will ease his conscience. I am satisfied with having defeated him in his own castle. In truth, he is too cunning to be acute. There is no stamen in his wisdom. It is all head and no body, like the pictures of the goddess Laverna, or at least all heads and no shoulder, like a codfish. But he is a good fellow after all. I like him, especially for one master stroke of cant, by which he has attained that reputation for ingenuity which he possesses. I mean, the way he has de nier ce qui est, et d'expliquer ce qui n'est pas." And that is the end of the story. It was so long. About an hour and a half. So, at what point did you see this coming? What did we think? Did you figure out who it was or what all those things meant? There was a point. I'm trying to think exactly what he said. Yeah, I think David is actually just saying to me the same thing. I told David earlier, I told David, I said, I wonder if you're going to have a hard time with this. It's like a murder mystery. Like, what could you do? And he's like, nah, I'll be fine. And he just texted me. He's like, I don't know. I personally thought that perhaps you could make something out of like what happened with the finding the orangutan in the Indian islands, of the friend dying and having to hide it, and then it escaping, right? And that moment, and then the murder itself. That's what I would imagine in improv, but that's just me. So I guess you can just text me, David, if you want. Do you want to try something, or do you want to leave it there? Either way is fine. I'm getting typing bubbles. Let's see. All right. He said no improv tonight. That's all right. I just thought it would be a little different story and a little longer, since again we haven't had a Patreon night in a while. So yeah, let me know in the live chat. Did you figure out what it was, or did you figure out the murderer, or kind of where it was going? When I first was reading it, I was looking at all the suspects not the suspects, but all the people who were interviewed, and I was like, okay, somebody here is lying, and I was looking at all the details, and then the more that we started looking at, the more he started explaining the things that he was seeing, the reasons, I was like, oh my gosh, this is not a human. This is definitely not a human. And then I was like, oh, I remember now a story about an orangutan. So yeah. All right, then. David says we'll leave it there, so we will leave it there. Unless you could think of a song. Let's see. What song could I sing? Emily, any thoughts? Diana, Nicole? Kelsey? Any songs that would go well with a murder mystery, monkey. I could do Jungle Book. Yeah, Jungle Book's all I got. Any ideas? But again, not we can leave it there. I would play it, but that has tough chords. Whew. And it is late. Oh, my dad said he loved this story. That's good. I was worried it was going to be like boring for you guys. It's interesting to read. I was like, I hope they like it. Emily says, sure, Jungle Book. Let me see if I can find a little different version of this. Oof. Then I'm going to have to. I was saying before. How about the hey, hey, we're the monkeys. People say we monkey around, so you'd better get ready. Yeah, let me see if there's, let me see if there is a, weird. Okay. Oh, gosh. Oh, wait, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Rocky Raccoon. I like that as well. Yeah, you know what? That's right. I like it. Rocky Raccoon. I like it because it's not on the nose. It's still about a murder. And it's one of the few murder ballads I enjoy. I don't tend to enjoy murder ballads, but I do like this song. I'm just trying to find a track. I think this might be okay. I'm going to check it out before we start. I also have to adjust my volume probably. So let me do a little test before we go on. Let's see. Rocky had come, equipped with a gun, to shoot off the legs of his rival. His rival, it seemed, had broken his dreams by stealing the girl of his fancy. How's that balance? Is it okay? Or should I have my voice volume up real high right now, so I just want to make sure it's not too loud. What do you guys think? I'll give it a try. All right, let's do it. Rocky Raccoon. Now, somewhere in the black mining hills of Dakota, there lived a young boy named Rocky Raccoon. One day, his woman ran off with another guy. Hit Rocky in the eye. Rocky didn't like that, he said. I'm gonna get that boy. So one day, he walked into town, booked himself a room in the local saloon. And Rocky Raccoon checked into his room, only to find Gideon's Bible. Rocky had come, equipped with a gun, to shoot off the legs of his rival. His rival, it seems, had broken his dreams by stealing the girl of his fancy. Her name was McGill, and she called herself Lil, but everyone knew her as Nancy. Now she and her man, who called himself Dan, were in the next room at the hoedown. Rocky burst in and grinning a grin. He said, Danny boy, this is a showdown. But Daniel was hot and drew first and shot, and Rocky collapsed in the corner. Da 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 do 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 do. Doctor came in, stinking of gin, proceeded to lie on the table. He said, Rocky, you've met your match. Rock said, Doc, it's only a scratch, and I'll be better, Doc, as soon as I am able. Now Rocky Raccoon fell back in his room, only to find Gideon's Bible. Gideon checked out, and he left it, no doubt, to help with good Rocky's revival. Yeah! Do 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 da 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 do 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 do. And that's the Ballad of Rocky Raccoon. All right. So, yeah, like I said, I would like to do another Patreon night soon, like I said, to make up for some of the ones we missed. Though this was like a double episode, but I will find another one. I'll probably do another Poe, but I'll do like a more traditional Poe. I just want to do something different this time. So did you see how it was like Sherlock, right? Like it was a lot like Sherlock Holmes, as far as the character and, when did the camera do that again? At what point did this happen? How long? I haven't been watching because I've been reading. Boo, where's my camera? There it is. I don't know what is going on with my camera. Boop. Hi. Other way. Anyways, so I don't know what's going on with that either. But anyways, so yeah, I'll probably go back to like a little bit more in the vein of stories that we've been reading. But like I said, it's just something different today. So, all right. I'll let you know, like I said, probably a week or two. I mean, could be two, but I'll try to do it next weekend or the weekend after, depending on what's happening with rehearsals and all that. David, how did I know that you were going to say it? When I read it, because David said, very much like Sherlock, but with the correct use of the term inductive reasoning versus Sherlock, which attributes to deduction that which is actually induction. It's true. And Emily says, I like the SpongeBob Pineapple House. Yeah, this is something, that I made when we did the, this is even so like SpongeBob-y. Yeah, I made that when we did the SpongeBob play. So I was like, yeah, that's mine. My pineapple house. So eventually I'll try to hang it up. Oh, wrong way. Yeah. So I was very proud of that. All right. So like I said, we'll finish there, but we'll be back, like I said, My guess is 2 weeks, but I don't know. It just kind of depends on our rehearsal schedule. So I will message you guys and we'll get back on that. And hopefully, again, I have to talk to Paul, and he's traveling and stuff, so I haven't wanted to bug him about doing a show, and I'm in my own show. But we've already like talked about what our next show is gonna be, so hopefully we'll be able to get that together. I'll be in a writing mood soon. I just haven't been with all the job stuff going on with me, and adding on to a story has been tough, but I am gonna get there. Hopefully once I get through this initial part of my training, I'll feel a little bit better and relaxed and ready to go. Yes, I mean, if I really feel like I'm still struggling with writing soon, yeah, I'll bring on a co-host and I'll have Paul do it. Like we've done with Paul, where Paul just is on the call if we need to. Yeah, because it'd be really cool to have Darcy back on again, and LA Beatles and several other people. So hopefully we'll get that to you soon. Yeah, and now you'll all have Rocky Raccoon in your head for a while. It's extremely catchy. All right, then I'm gonna sign off there. Again, thank you guys so much for being here, for being part of the Patreon. It's so cool, especially like since we haven't been able to record lately, that you are still sticking around and supporting us. It's amazing. So thank you. And so I will sign off. I hope everybody has an incredible week ahead of you. Have a good rest of your weekend and have a great week. I will see you soon. Good night.